In this video, I want to show you a little bit more about the index match functions in Excel that we have seen in some of our modules. And in this case, I've implemented the schedule of the 2011 Cleveland Browns, their traveling schedule basically. So in the figure on the right, you can see their schedule and which city they're playing in and of what weeks. So the goal of this is actually to use another spreadsheet which I've got labeled as the NFL travel matrix. And we can see that I have listed here all of the NFL cities and across the rows, so that would be our from. And then across the columns I also have all the NFL cities, and that would be our to. So this matrix basically represents the miles in between cities. So the mileage from Arizona to Arizona is 0. The mileage from Arizona to Atlanta is 1587, and so forth. So the goal of this exercise is to use our index match function to calculate how many miles were traveled by the Browns in the 2011 season. So to get started, we want to break this problem up like we've seen in a couple of our module exercises. And the first thing I want to do is find the appropriate row. And what I'm going to use is our match function. So match, our lookup value in this case, we'll consider the home column as our from, and our column or our to as the away city. So we're going to select Cleveland in this case for our lookup value. And our lookup value, or lookup array I should say, is not actually in this sheet. It's in the different tab called NFL Travel Matrix. So we're going to go over here and actually select the entire range from the from categories. And I'm just going to go ahead and lock that in with F4 and hit comma. And now it's asking us for the match type. Now in this case, I want an exact match, and I've mentioned this before that probably 99% of the time I always use the 0 or exact match. And there's going to be an example of why I want that exact match in my sheet here. So I'm going to put the exact match and just finish off this. And we notice we return an 8. So let's go ahead and look at why this returns an 8. And remember, we're looking up Cleveland. Okay, so if we actually go over to our NFL travel matrix, remember we selected B3 through B34. And if we're looking up Cleveland, let's start at the very top and just kind of highlight this range. We see that Cleveland actually appears in B10. But as far as the range is concerned, I want you to keep an eye on this portion of Excel right here, and it'll actually tell you how many rows you've got selected. So actually you'll see an 8 row by 1 column. So it means that we've got 8 rows selected. So in terms of this entire range of the from cities, Cleveland is in the 8th cell down, which is why we see an 8 here in our from category. Okay, we're going to do the same thing for the column. So we're going to use a match. And in this case, I'm going to look up Cincinnati. My lookup array will be across the columns here. And I'm going to lock that in with F4 and finish off with a match type of 0. So great, we have 7. So likewise, if we take a look at this 2 array, we started at C2. And if we go over 7, we'll notice in Cincinnati is in the 7th cell over from the beginning, starting at C2. So that is why it returns the 7. Okay, so we can actually index this. An index simply requires an array and which column and which row you actually want to index. So it's essentially returning a value from an array. In this case, row 8, column 7. So if we use the index, we can go over to our array, And actually, the entire array is inside of your row and column labels. So starting at C3 all the way over to AH and down. So it'd be C3 to AH34. And I'm going to go ahead and lock that with F4 and hit my comma. And now it's asking me for a row. Well, we've already got that here in column D. So I'm going to simply reference this. And you notice as we switch sheets, it actually puts all of this Cleveland Browns 2011 schedule there. We can actually delete that if you want to keep this a little bit more clean. And we're actually going to reference this too. And since it's on this sheet that we actually want to reference, we actually don't need all of this stuff. So we can delete it. I'm simply going to hit my parenthesis and enter. And we see that from Cleveland to Cincinnati, it's roughly 220 miles, let's just say. 219 to be more specific. So after we formatted that to show 0 decimal places, I'm actually going to drag all three of these formulas down. And we notice we get an NA. And you got to ask yourself, well, why are we getting an NA? Well, it's because there's no city in our array over here, our lookup arrays, that actually are named by. The closest thing, here would be Baltimore and Buffalo. So anyway, I always like to capture my errors, which is why I like to do match type 0 all the time. And there's a neat little function in Excel called if error. And if there's not an error in this statement, meaning an NA doesn't show up, we can go ahead and return this value of our match. However, if there is an error, value if error is the parameter, we can actually type whatever we want. So we can say not in lookup array, or just simply error or match not found, and what have you. So if we drag that formula down, we can actually see our text coming up because NA is a form of error, similar to divide by 0. And I'm going to actually do this for the column 2 because, like I said, I always like to catch my errors, and usually I use conditional formatting to say, hey, if this is actually not found in my lookup, I'll highlight it red, noting that there is a problem and I can't calculate a distance, let's just say, from a by to a by, because that's not an actual city. So I'm actually going to put in the if error again and return the value if this statement does not return an error. And if it does, I'm just going to simply say not in lookup array and fill this formula down. And we can do the same thing here in distance and say, well, if we get a value, we can just return to 0 perhaps. Or we could return the same type of an error message that it wasn't in our lookup array. But in this case, I'm just going to return a 0 because actually that week there was no traveling. So I'm going to hit enter, and I noticed I didn't complete my sentence here of not, so I'm just going to go ahead and fix that. Not in travel, not in lookup array. Fill that down. And now to calculate the total distance, let's do a little binary encoding. And I'm going to say Cleveland home. Now that we've typed the column label Cleveland home, let me tell you a little bit about the mindset behind what we're doing here. What we've done so far is actually calculated or determined the appropriate distance from the home to away city. But if you're the Cleveland Browns and you're playing at home and you're playing Cincinnati as being the away team, so you're playing in Cleveland Browns Stadium, you actually didn't have to travel. So we actually want to use a binary encoding to calculate the appropriate distance. So anytime the Browns are playing at home, I actually want to return 0 miles because they're not actually traveling to a city. Likewise, if they are the away team, I'm actually going to want to multiply that distance by 2. Because if they go and they play Indianapolis, let's say, and Cleveland is the away team, they're actually going to go there, which is 261 miles, but they actually have to come back. So I'm going to first create this binary encoding to determine if Cleveland is the home team or away team, and then use that to adjust the distances. So let's use our if, and our logical test if is B2 is equal to Cleveland, the text. We can return a 1, else return a 0. And I'm going to fill that formula down, and I'm going to move this schedule over just a little bit, and I'm going to call this the adjusted distance. And again, I'm going to write an if statement, and I'm going to say if this column or this value equals a 1, we need to return a 0 because there's no traveling being done by the Browns from their home city of Cleveland to an away city. And likewise, if this is not true, I actually want to multiply the distance by 2 because they not only have to go there, but they have to come back. So you can see in this case we return a 0 because the home city is in Cleveland. If we drag this formula just down 1, we see that miles is 222.7, which is 2 times 261 essentially, because they're playing in Indianapolis. So they have to get there and come home to Cleveland. So let me go ahead and fill this formula down. And I'm actually going to take this format of a number and use our command to actually paste this format using our shortcut key Alt EST, and go ahead and hit enter, and we can see that format has transferred over to our selected cells. Now that we have our adjusted distance calculated, we can just take a sum of those values to calculate the total miles traveled by the Browns in the 2011 season. So now that we've completed that exercise, I just want to show you a couple different features about Excel. Namely, inside the formula ribbon, there's a couple different options that you can use to audit your formulas. For example, let's go ahead and hit trace precedence. Now, the things that we need to calculate this D2 value, one appears off the sheet, and one actually appears here in our column B, row 2. So this kind of gives you an idea of what's required to actually make this function work, in this case our if error match formula. If we remove arrows and we actually leave it on this cell D2, we can trace the dependence. And we can actually trace the dependence, and we know that this formula in F2, which is our distance using the index, requires this from value here. So it gives you a nice little way of tracking down what's actually being referenced if you ever have an error. And just again, I'll just trace the dependence on F2 here. And we can see that H2 is actually dependent upon this value. And finally, let me trace the precedence. And we can see that there are 2 values that are required. And you can do this also by double clicking and seeing the colors that are highlighted around. But it also lets you know that there's a reference outside or off of this worksheet. It's in another tab, if you will. So let's go ahead and remove those errors. I just wanted to show you that feature because it is kind of important once your spreadsheets get so large. It gets harder and harder to evaluate your formula. And for that matter, there is a neat button here called Evaluate Formula. And you can actually step in and evaluate these formulas. So if you notice what is underlined, it's going to be evaluated. So this E2 is equal to 7, so that's where we'll see our 7. Now it's going to evaluate this index, which is our 219.2, and the if error is going to be evaluated. In this case, there is no error, so it's actually going to return the 219, and you can restart it as many times you want to kind of get an idea of where your formulas are going wrong. Okay, now that we know what is a precedent or a dependent cell for these formulas, what I would actually do is try to merge all of the formulas that we have written from our row and our column into the index match itself. Typically, if you're beginning and you haven't seen these functions, I would highly encourage you to break this down into as many steps as possible. But once you get familiar with these steps, very rarely will you actually create a separate column to determine the row number and a separate column to determine the column number. So let's go ahead and look at our distance formula, and we can see it's referencing D2 and E2. So what I want to do is go inside D2 and simply copy this whole array, whole formula, and I want to paste it into the correct location. So I'm just looking at the colors and I'm finding D2 and I'm pasting that formula. I hit enter just to make sure that it's working correctly. I want to do the same thing for our column formula, and double click that and notice that it is a green, so it's over here at E2. Paste this in, hit enter, and make sure our formula is working correctly, and simply fill this formula down. And I'm going to hit F2 to bring up my formula, and I notice now it's not requiring D2 or E2 because we've embedded those formulas directly into our index match.